The tension in the airplane cabin was palpable, as though the air had thickened with unspoken conflict. Eliza sat by the window, her calm exterior hiding the storm of emotions brewing inside her. Across the aisle stood Diana, the sharp-featured flight attendant, her tone curt and cutting as she delivered yet another demeaning remark. Eliza clenched her hands tightly, the humiliation from moments ago still fresh. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some stealing glances at her, others pretending not to notice. The weight of their stares only deepened her embarrassment. She had been singled out and humiliated in front of strangers, and now an unexpected battle of wills was unfolding, one that would test not only her patience but her resolve. What began as a routine flight was about to become a story of defiance, quiet strength, and justice. Before we dive deeper into this compelling tale of dignity and redemption, comment below with where you're watching from today. And if this story captures your interest, don't forget to subscribe, so you won't miss any of our meaningful stories. Eliza sat quietly by the airplane window, the low hum of the engines offering little solace to her racing thoughts. At 45, she had mastered the art of calm, navigating life's storms with grace and patience. Yet, this flight seemed different, as an unexpected series of events would soon test her composure. Eliza was a petite woman, standing just over 5 feet tall, with a neat and professional appearance. Her black wavy hair was pulled back into a sleek ponytail, and she wore a white blouse adorned with subtle floral patterns, paired with a knee-length black skirt. Her choice of flat shoes hinted at practicality over style. Today, she was accompanying her boss, Mark, on a work trip, a man known for his blunt demeanor but sharp insights. Mark, a slim figure in his early 40s, was clad in a navy suit that appeared too large, adding a somewhat comical air to his otherwise serious persona. The duo found themselves seated in the emergency exit row, a position Eliza was ambivalent about. While she appreciated the extra legroom, the idea of being near the exit stirred a vague sense of unease. She wasn't a frequent flyer, and the weight of potential responsibility loomed in her mind. As the other passengers settled into their seats, Eliza tried to focus on her surroundings, noting the steady buzz of chatter and the occasional click of seatbelts being fastened. Then, she noticed her. A tall flight attendant with sharp features and impatience walked briskly down the aisle. Her uniform, immaculate and marked by an orange scarf, exuded professionalism, but her body language suggested otherwise. The name tag pinned to her chest read, Diana. There was an edge to her movements, as if she carried a simmering frustration barely concealed beneath the polished exterior. When Diana reached their row, she stopped abruptly and scanned Eliza from head to toe. "You need to change seats," Diana said, her tone firm and loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Eliza blinked, startled. "Excuse me?" she replied, unsure if she'd misheard. Diana's gaze narrowed, her voice taking on a sharper edge. "This is the emergency exit row. You're too large to sit here. Regulations require passengers in these seats to be of a certain size to operate the exit in case of an emergency." The words landed like a slap. Eliza felt her heart skip a beat, her cheeks flushing crimson as the weight of humiliation bore down on her. Around her, the hum of conversation faltered. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pretending not to notice, while others openly stared. I'm sorry," Eliza stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't realize." Diana cut her off with a dismissive wave of her hand. "No excuses," she snapped. "You'll need to move. I'll find you another seat." The air seemed to thicken, each syllable of Diana's reprimand driving the sting of embarrassment deeper. Eliza's boss, Mark, fidgeted beside her, his usual air of confidence replaced by an awkward silence. He glanced away, avoiding eye contact, leaving Eliza to fend for herself. Eliza stood, swallowing the lump in her throat, clutching her bag with trembling hands. She felt the eyes of the passengers burning into her back as Diana directed her to a seat several rows away. The journey down the narrow aisle felt excruciatingly long, and by the time she reached her new spot, Eliza's face was damp with unshed tears. She sank into the seat, her vision blurred as she tried to process what had just happened. The plane began to taxi down the runway, and Eliza forced herself to look out the window, willing the fresh tears in her eyes to stay put. The hum of the engines grew louder, yet the sting of Diana's words reverberated in her mind. No amount of deep breathing could ease the ache of humiliation, and she wondered how she would endure the long flight ahead. Mark's voice broke through her haze of thoughts. "That was uncalled for," he muttered, his tone hesitant. "It's fine," Eliza replied, though her voice wavered. "It's just embarrassing, that's all." She turned to the window, her reflection in the glass a painful reminder of her vulnerability. Diana's dismissive words replayed in her head, each one a barb that cut deeper than the last. Eliza wasn't overweight, not by any measure. Yet, the public nature of Diana's comment made her feel small and insignificant, as if her presence on that plane was somehow an inconvenience. As the plane climbed steadily into the sky, Eliza struggled to steady her emotions. She wanted to be angry and confront Diana for her rudeness, but the enormity of her humiliation left her feeling paralyzed. For now, she resolved to remain quiet and endure the flight without further incident. But deep down, a flicker of defiance began to take root, a quiet determination that this would not be the end of her story. Eliza sat in her new seat, trying to regain her composure. The sting of Diana's words lingered, a sharp echo of humiliation that refused to fade. Around her, the passengers had resumed their conversations, but she still felt their fleeting glances, their whispered comments. It was as if the weight of their curiosity pressed down on her, amplifying her discomfort. Mark, seated several rows ahead, turned briefly to look at her before quickly averting his gaze. His awkwardness was almost tangible, and for a moment Eliza wished he had said something, anything, to support her. But she understood his silence. Mark wasn't the type to get involved in conflicts, especially those outside the scope of his professional responsibilities. As the plane leveled out and the seatbelt sign dimmed, the tension in the cabin seemed to dissipate slightly. Passengers began to settle in, some pulling out books, others adjusting their seats for a nap. Eliza tried to do the same, but no amount of shifting could make her feel comfortable. Her mind wandered back to the moment Diana had publicly humiliated her. It wasn't just the insult that hurt, it was the deliberate, almost calculated way Diana had said it, loud enough for everyone to hear. The comment had felt less like a professional correction and more like a personal attack. Eliza wasn't a confrontational person by nature, but this incident gnawed at her, making it hard to let go. She clenched her hands into fists, the leather of her handbag creaking softly under the pressure. No, she told herself firmly, she wouldn't let Diana ruin her day. This flight was just a few hours, she could endure it. But then, the situation escalated. About an hour into the flight, the discomfort Eliza had been suppressing became unbearable. She needed to use the restroom, a basic necessity she could no longer ignore. She shifted in her seat, trying to will the urge away, but her body was insistent. She hesitated, glancing at the aisle where Diana was making her rounds. The memory of Diana's sharp words earlier made Eliza hesitate, but this was something she couldn't avoid. Turning to the passenger next to her, she excused herself softly and stood, steadying herself on the armrest. The narrow aisle felt longer than it was as she made her way toward the back of the plane, where Diana stood. The flight attendant's sharp features and upright posture made her seem like a sentry guarding an invisible fortress. Eliza approached cautiously. "Excuse me," she began, keeping her tone polite but firm. "I need to use the restroom." Diana's eyes flicked toward her, her expression already unreadable. For a brief moment, Eliza thought her request would be met with a simple nod or an indication of where to go. But instead, Diana's lips curled into a thin, condescending smile. "The only way to the restroom," Diana said loudly, "is if the captain lands the plane and lets you out." Eliza froze, her mind stumbling over the words. At first, she thought it might be a joke, a dry attempt at humor, but the steely glint in Diana's eyes told her otherwise. "I'm sorry?" Eliza asked, her voice trembling slightly. "You heard me," Diana replied, her tone laced with mockery. "The restroom isn't available right now. You'll have to wait." The dismissal was sharp, cutting through the hum of the cabin. Eliza felt the sting of humiliation all over again as the passengers nearby turned to watch. Their curious eyes seemed to strip her of any remaining dignity, leaving her feeling exposed and powerless. Eliza began, but her voice faltered. The lump in her throat made it hard to form words. Without waiting for a response, Diana turned away, resuming her tasks as if Eliza were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Eliza stood there for a moment, stunned into silence. The heat of embarrassment rose to her cheeks, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. The urge to defend herself, to demand an explanation, bubbled beneath the surface, but the weight of the earlier incident held her back. Lowering her gaze, Eliza turned and walked back to her seat. Her steps felt heavier with each passing moment, and by the time she sat down, her hands were trembling. The passenger seated beside her glanced over, concern flickering in their eyes. "Are you okay?" they asked softly. Eliza forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But she wasn't fine. Far from it. As the minutes ticked by, Eliza's frustration grew. It wasn't just the physical discomfort of needing the restroom. It was the principle of the matter. Diana's behavior wasn't just unprofessional. It was downright cruel. Eliza didn't deserve to be treated this way, and she knew it. Her hands gripped the armrests tightly as her mind raced. She thought about the other passengers who had witnessed the exchange, their silence as deafening as Diana's harsh words. It wasn't fair, and yet Eliza wasn't ready to give up. She glanced toward the front of the plane, where another flight attendant, this one younger, with kind eyes and a softer demeanor, was tending to passengers. A plan began to form in Eliza's mind. Perhaps she didn't need to confront Diana directly. Perhaps there was another way to address this situation, one that didn't involve stooping to Diana's level. Taking a deep breath, Eliza resolved to wait for the right moment. She wouldn't let her anger consume her, nor would she let Diana think she'd won. For now, she would bide her time, holding on to the quiet strength that had carried her through countless challenges before. Eliza sat still in her seat, her mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Her frustration bubbled beneath the surface, growing stronger with every passing moment. The sharp embarrassment from Diana's curt dismissal still stung, but it had begun to morph into something else. Resolve. She tried to focus on the hum of the airplane engines or the soft murmur of conversations around her, but nothing could drown out the memory of Diana's sharp words. Eliza wasn't the type to seek confrontation, but something about this situation gnawed at her deeply. Diana hadn't just been rude, she had been deliberately cruel. As Eliza stared out of the small airplane window, she noticed her reflection looking back at her. A woman determined not to let this moment define her. She sat straighter in her seat, her hands resting firmly on her lap. If Diana expected her to retreat into silence, she was mistaken. The fasten seatbelt sign blinked off, and the cabin came to life with movement. Passengers stretched, attendants moved about delivering drinks, and the quiet hum of activity filled the space. Eliza watched Diana from the corner of her eye. The flight attendant's movements were brisk, her face set in a mask of indifference. But Eliza noticed something else, a stiffness in Diana's posture, a tension that hadn't been there earlier. Eliza shifted her focus to the other flight attendant she had seen earlier, the one with kind eyes and a soft demeanor. She seemed younger, less hardened by the job. Eliza took a moment to steady her thoughts, then unbuckled her seatbelt. As she stood, her legs wobbled slightly, a reminder of how long she had waited to use the restroom. With a deep breath, she made her way toward the back of the plane, where the younger flight attendant was stationed near the galley. "Excuse me," Eliza said softly, her voice firm but polite. The young woman turned to her with a warm smile. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Eliza hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much to say. But then she remembered Diana's cutting words, the weight of the humiliation she had endured. She couldn't stay silent. "I'm not sure if you're aware," Eliza began, choosing her words carefully, "but one of your colleagues, Diana, has been less than professional with me." The attendant's expression shifted, her smile fading into a look of concern. "Oh? I'm so sorry to hear that. Could you tell me what happened?" Eliza explained the incident succinctly, recounting how Diana had loudly demanded she change seats and later dismissed her need to use the restroom with a sarcastic comment. She didn't embellish or exaggerate, sticking to the facts. The young attendant listened intently, nodding occasionally. Her kind eyes were filled with sympathy. "I'm truly sorry you've had to experience that," she said when Eliza finished. That's not how we want any of our passengers to feel." Eliza felt a small wave of relief at the sincerity in her voice. She hadn't expected much, perhaps just a polite acknowledgement of her complaint, but the attendant's response gave her a glimmer of hope. "I'll bring this to the captain's attention," the young woman continued. "We take these matters seriously, and I'll make sure it's addressed." Eliza nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. "Thank you. I appreciate it." The attendant offered her a reassuring smile before heading toward the cockpit. Eliza returned to her seat, her mind buzzing with a mix of emotions. For the first time since the flight began, she felt a small sense of agency, a flicker of hope that the situation might improve. Meanwhile, Diana continued her rounds, her demeanor as sharp as ever. But Eliza noticed something different now. A subtle tension in the way Diana moved, as though she were aware that her behavior had been reported. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. Eliza's need to use the restroom hadn't diminished, but she chose to wait. She didn't want to give Diana the satisfaction of seeing her struggle. As the young attendant returned from the cockpit, she caught Eliza's eye and gave her a small nod. Eliza wasn't sure what that meant, but it felt significant. A quiet promise that something was being done. Diana, meanwhile, passed by Eliza's seat, her expression tighter than before. There was no trace of her earlier arrogance. Instead, her jaw was set, her lips pressed into a thin line. Eliza could feel the shift in the air. Diana wasn't in control anymore, and she knew it. For Eliza, this was a small but meaningful victory. She had taken action, not with anger or aggression, but with calm determination. It wasn't about revenge, it was about standing up for herself in a way that felt true to who she was. As the flight continued, Eliza allowed herself to breathe a little easier. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time since boarding the plane, she felt a sense of calm. The humiliation she had endured hadn't vanished, but it no longer weighed as heavily on her. She glanced out the window again, watching the clouds drift by. The sky stretched endlessly, a vast expanse of possibility. Eliza couldn't change what had happened, but she could control how she responded, and that, she realized, was its own kind of power. Eliza's gaze remained fixed out the window, but her thoughts were far from serene. The interaction with the young attendant had provided some solace, yet the sting of Diana's earlier actions lingered. It wasn't just the words themselves, but the audacity with which Diana had humiliated her in front of the entire cabin. She sat back, taking a deep breath, her hands resting on the armrests as she tried to regain her focus. Around her, the hum of the plane's engines blended with the faint chatter of passengers. A child giggled in a row further ahead, and somewhere in the distance, the clink of a drink cart echoed. These sounds felt almost surreal, like background noise in a drama she couldn't escape. From the corner of her eye, she caught Diana moving through the aisle again. The flight attendant's posture was rigid, her expression taut with a forced calmness. It was as if Diana was aware of the complaint lodged against her, and it was beginning to affect her demeanor. This observation stirred a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation in Eliza. Moments later, Eliza overheard a snippet of conversation from the row in front of her. A man, his voice low but audible, whispered to the woman beside him. "That flight attendant, Diana, she's always like this. I've flown with her before." The woman nodded, her voice tinged with annoyance. "I remember her from my last trip. She made me feel terrible for asking for a blanket. It's like she goes out of her way to be unpleasant." Eliza leaned back slightly, processing what she'd just heard. This wasn't an isolated incident. Diana had a history of treating passengers poorly, and yet she was still in a position where she could continue to behave this way. It wasn't just Eliza who suffered. Others suffered too. This realization shifted something inside her. While Eliza had initially internalized Diana's actions as a personal slight, she now saw them for what they were, a pattern of unprofessionalism and disrespect. This wasn't just about her. It was about ensuring that Diana's behavior didn't go unchecked. Eliza's resolve hardened. She thought back to the young attendant's promise to escalate the matter to the captain. If Diana's behavior wasn't addressed now, who knew how many more passengers would be subjected to the same treatment? As if on cue, the young attendant appeared at the front of the cabin. Her kind eyes scanned the rows briefly before she made her way toward Eliza. She leaned down, speaking just above a whisper. "I've spoken to the captain. He's aware of the situation. Please feel free to use the restroom now if you need to." Eliza blinked in surprise, her body flooding with relief at the words. The young attendant's calm demeanor and proactive approach were a stark contrast to Diana's behavior. Eliza nodded, offering a sincere "thank you." She stood carefully, feeling the discomfort in her legs and the mounting urgency she had tried to suppress for so long. As she walked down the aisle toward the restroom, she passed Diana, who was now standing near the galley. Their eyes met briefly, and Eliza noted the change in Diana's expression. Gone was the condescending smirk, replaced by a tightness around her mouth and a flicker of something else. Anger. Defeat? Eliza couldn't quite place it, but it didn't matter. She held her head high, refusing to let Diana's gaze unsettle her. The restroom was a small, cramped space, but to Eliza it felt like a sanctuary. She closed the door behind her and took a moment to steady herself. Looking into the mirror, she saw her reflection staring back, calm, composed, and quietly triumphant. This wasn't just about winning a battle against Diana. It was about reclaiming her dignity, something Diana had tried to strip away with her words and actions. Eliza smiled faintly at her reflection, a small but meaningful gesture of self-assurance. When she returned to her seat, she noticed a shift in the atmosphere. Diana's presence, which had loomed large over the cabin earlier, now seemed diminished. She moved less confidently, her interactions with passengers subdued. Eliza sensed that the young attendant's actions had already begun to take effect. A new flight attendant appeared in the aisle, her demeanor warm and approachable. She introduced herself as Sophie, explaining that she would be assisting for the remainder of the flight. Eliza didn't need an explicit explanation to understand what had happened. Diana had been quietly reassigned. Eliza glanced toward the front of the plane, where Diana now stood, her posture stiff and her face pale. It was clear she wasn't pleased with this turn of events, but Eliza felt no pity for her. Diana had made her choices, and now she was facing the consequences. Sophie approached Eliza with a kind smile. "Is there anything I can get for you, ma'am?" Eliza shook her head. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Sophie's smile widened. "Well, if you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." As Sophie moved on, Eliza leaned back in her seat, feeling a sense of relief wash over her. The worst of the flight was behind her, and she knew she had handled the situation in a way that aligned with her values. She hadn't resorted to anger or confrontation. Instead, she had taken a calm, measured approach that had ultimately made all the difference. Outside the window, the vast expanse of clouds stretched endlessly, a reminder of the freedom and possibility that awaited her once the plane landed. For now, Eliza allowed herself to relax, and her mind was finally at ease. The storm had passed, and she had emerged stronger for it. Eliza rested in her seat, letting the tension ebb away like waves retreating from the shore. The subtle but profound shift in the cabin's atmosphere didn't escape her notice. Diana, once so confident and unyielding, now carried herself with the hesitant movements of someone walking on eggshells. Though Eliza hadn't intended to spark a confrontation when she first approached the young attendant, she now felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that her voice had made an impact. It wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. Sophie, the newly arrived attendant, bustled down the aisle with a tray of drinks, her demeanor radiating warmth and professionalism. Passengers responded to her presence with smiles and polite requests, a stark contrast to the tension that had permeated the cabin earlier. As Sophie approached Eliza's row, she paused with a friendly nod. "Ma'am, can I offer you a drink or snack?" Eliza smiled faintly. "Just some water, please." Sophie quickly retrieved a small bottle of water, placing it on Eliza's tray table. "If there's anything else you need, don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you," Eliza replied, appreciating Sophie's attentiveness. From the corner of her eye, Eliza spotted Diana standing near the galley, her expression hard to read. For a fleeting moment their eyes met, and Diana quickly looked away, her lips pressed into a thin line. The once overbearing flight attendant now seemed diminished, her authority undermined by her own actions. Eliza wasn't one to take pleasure in someone else's discomfort, but she couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing Diana face the consequences of her behavior. Her earlier humiliation had been a heavy weight, but now she felt lighter, as though she had reclaimed some part of herself that Diana had tried to strip away. The faint hum of conversation around her grew louder as passengers settled further into the flight. Eliza glanced at the couple seated ahead, who had earlier discussed Diana's history of rudeness. Their conversation had slowed, but the woman turned briefly, offering Eliza a knowing smile. It was a small gesture, but it carried a sense of solidarity. Eliza's thoughts drifted to what lay ahead after the flight. She had prepared meticulously for the work presentation she and Mark were scheduled to deliver, and while the events on the plane had shaken her, they hadn't derailed her resolve. In fact, they had reinforced it. Just then, the young attendant who had helped her earlier, Anna, appeared from the cockpit area and made her way down the aisle. She paused briefly beside Eliza, her expression calm yet reassuring. "Is everything all right now?" she asked in a low voice, careful not to draw unnecessary attention. "Yes," Eliza said, nodding. "Thank you for stepping in earlier. It made all the difference." Anna smiled softly. "I'm glad to hear that. We're here to ensure every passenger feels comfortable and respected. If there's anything else you need, please let me know." As Anna walked away, Eliza felt a wave of gratitude. The young woman's intervention had been a pivotal moment, one that shifted the course of the flight. Eliza couldn't help but wonder if Diana had faced similar complaints before, and how many others had endured her behavior in silence. Meanwhile, Diana remained at the back of the plane, her movements mechanical as she busied herself with tasks that seemed deliberately chosen to avoid interacting with passengers. Eliza's gaze lingered on Diana for a moment, then turned back to the window. The clouds outside seemed to stretch endlessly, a reminder of the vast world beyond this plane and the smallness of this moment in the grander scheme of things. Still, Eliza couldn't dismiss the significance of what had transpired. She had spoken up not just for herself, but for every passenger who had felt belittled or dismissed by Diana's actions. The experience had reminded her of the importance of standing her ground, even in the face of adversity. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, signaling the midpoint of the flight. Passengers began shifting in their seats, some retrieving items from overhead compartments, while others engaged in quiet conversations. The hum of activity provided a soothing backdrop as Eliza allowed herself to relax further. She thought about Mark, seated several rows ahead. His silence during the earlier incident still stung, though she understood his reluctance to intervene. Perhaps, when the flight ended, she'd talk to him about it. Not to chastise him, but to help him see the importance of standing up for others, even in uncomfortable situations. For now, though, Eliza chose to focus on the positive. The flight was no longer a source of dread, but a reminder of her resilience. She had weathered the storm and emerged stronger, armed with a renewed sense of self-worth. Diana's actions had been a test, albeit an unwelcome one, and Eliza had passed it with grace and intelligence. The lesson wasn't lost on her. Dignity and respect were not privileges to be granted by others, but inherent rights that one must uphold for themselves. As the plane cruised steadily at its altitude, Eliza leaned back in her seat, feeling a sense of calm settle over her. The path to reclaiming her confidence hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The journey wasn't over yet, neither the flight nor the broader journey of navigating life's challenges. But for the first time in hours, Eliza felt prepared for whatever came next. The airplane cabin hummed with its usual blend of ambient noises, the soft whir of the engines, the occasional clink of cups as the attendants moved about, and the murmured conversations of passengers. Yet, amid the normalcy, an unspoken tension lingered. Eliza, now seated comfortably and sipping her water, felt the shift. Diana's presence, once commanding and overbearing, seemed to have shrunk into the background. The passengers who had initially glanced at Eliza with either curiosity or indifference now appeared relaxed, their interest redirected to other matters. Still, Eliza couldn't help but notice the occasional flickers of awareness when Diana moved about the cabin. A faint ripple of unease followed the flight attendant, like the trailing echo of a misstep in an otherwise harmonious rhythm. Diana's sharp posture and tightened jawline betrayed her discomfort, and her every movement was carefully calculated to avoid further scrutiny. Eliza observed this transformation with quiet satisfaction. It wasn't that she reveled in Diana's discomfort, but there was a sense of justice in seeing her held accountable. The earlier sting of Diana's cruel remarks had faded, replaced by a steady resolve. As Eliza allowed her thoughts to wander, the couple seated in front of her resumed their earlier conversation. Their voices were low, but the words carried just enough for Eliza to catch. "She's been this way for years, apparently," the woman said, her tone a mix of frustration and disbelief. "I've flown with her twice now, and it's always the same, condescending and rude." The man nodded, his voice laced with agreement. "You'd think someone would have done something by now. It's not like passengers don't notice." Eliza's chest tightened momentarily at their words. So Diana's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, one that had gone unchecked for too long. This revelation both disheartened and empowered her. While it was frustrating to think Diana had been allowed to behave this way repeatedly, it also reaffirmed the importance of standing up, not just for herself, but for others. Determined not to dwell on negativity, Eliza let her gaze shift toward Sophie, the new attendant who had replaced Diana on the floor. Sophie moved gracefully through the aisles, her warm demeanor drawing smiles from passengers. She paused beside Eliza's row once again, offering a cheerful, "Everything all right here?" "Yes. Thank you," Eliza replied, her voice steady. Sophie smiled and moved on, her presence a stark contrast to Diana's. Eliza couldn't help but appreciate the calm professionalism Sophie brought to the cabin. It was a reminder that respect and kindness should be the standard, not the exception. As the plane cruised steadily, Eliza turned her thoughts inward. The earlier exchange with Diana brought up memories of past situations where she had chosen silence over confrontation. There had been times when she'd second-guessed herself, wondering if she'd been too passive, too willing to let others dictate her worth. But this flight had changed something. Eliza glanced toward the back of the plane where Diana stood near the galley. The flight attendant's rigid posture was unmistakable, and her movements were less fluid than before. Diana avoided eye contact with passengers, her once dominant presence now subdued. At that moment, Eliza realized the power of her actions. By refusing to shrink under Diana's cruelty and calmly seeking help from someone willing to listen, she not only reclaims her dignity, but also sets an example for others. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane continued its journey. Eliza leaned back, letting the faint glow of her reading light cast a soft halo around her tray table. She reached for her bag, retrieving a book she had tucked away earlier. The familiar weight of the pages felt comforting in her hands, a grounding presence amidst the whirlwind of emotions she'd experienced. As she flipped through the pages, she caught snippets of activity in the aisle. Sophie was assisting a passenger with their luggage, her calm voice a soothing balm to the mild chaos of overhead compartments. Diana lingered nearby, her gaze flitting nervously between Sophie and the passengers. The contrast between the two attendants couldn't have been starker. While Sophie embodied the grace and attentiveness that passengers hoped for in their travels, Diana's demeanor was now a shadow of what it had been at the start of the flight. Eliza turned her attention back to her book, though her thoughts continued to swirl. She couldn't help but wonder what might come of this incident once the plane landed. Would Diana face formal consequences? Would the captain's awareness of the issue lead to action? Or would it become another anecdote buried beneath the countless stories of airline mishaps? These questions lingered as the hours ticked by, but Eliza chose to focus on what she could control, her own response to the situation. She had spoken up, stood her ground, and refused to let Diana's behavior define her experience. That, in itself, was enough. As the plane began its gradual descent, the familiar crackle of the intercom echoed through the cabin. The captain's voice came on, calm and composed, informing passengers of their estimated arrival time. The announcement was met with the usual rustling of belongings and quiet murmurs of anticipation. Eliza closed her book, tucking it carefully back into her bag. She felt a sense of closure, a quiet triumph that settled over her like a soft blanket. The flight hadn't been easy, but it had been transformative in ways she hadn't expected. Looking around the cabin, she noticed Diana once more. The flight attendant's stiff demeanor persisted. But there was something different now. An air of vulnerability, perhaps even regret. Eliza didn't dwell on it. Her focus was on what lay ahead, the new challenges and opportunities waiting for her beyond the confines of the plane. For the first time in hours, she felt truly at peace. As the plane began its descent, the hum of anticipation spread through the cabin. Passengers adjusted their seats, stowed away their belongings, and chatted quietly in preparation for landing. Eliza took the opportunity to reflect on the flight, a journey that had turned out to be far more eventful than she could have anticipated. The once overwhelming sting of Diana's words had diminished, replaced by a calmer resolve. This flight reminded Eliza of something she had always known but occasionally forgot. Respect and dignity were not things she needed to beg for. They were her rights. The faint murmurs from the couple in front of her drew her attention again. They had resumed their earlier conversation about Diana, though this time their words carried a sharper edge. "She made me feel like I was a burden just for asking for a blanket," the woman said, her voice low but filled with annoyance. "I can't believe she's still working on these flights." "It's not just you," the man replied. "Last time she barked at a passenger for taking too long to stow their bag. I overheard one of the crew say she's been reprimanded before, but nothing seems to change." Eliza's ears perked up. The pieces were starting to come together. Diana's behavior wasn't a one-time lapse in professionalism. It was a pattern, one that had apparently persisted despite previous warnings. Eliza found herself wondering how such behavior could continue unchecked in an industry that relied so heavily on customer service. Yet, as she mulled over the revelation, another thought struck her. Perhaps Diana's attitude wasn't born solely of arrogance. There might be something deeper fueling her rudeness. Stress, frustration, personal struggles. Whatever the root cause, it didn't excuse Diana's actions, but it provided a context that Eliza hadn't considered before. This realization softened the sharp edges of her anger. It didn't erase what Diana had done, but it reminded Eliza that people often carried burdens invisible to the outside world. That said, empathy didn't mean tolerance for mistreatment, and Eliza felt no regret for standing up for herself. As the flight attendants moved through the aisles conducting final checks, Eliza noticed Sophie speaking quietly with Diana. The two stood at the front of the plane, their expressions serious. While Eliza couldn't hear the conversation, the body language was telling. Sophie maintained a calm, steady demeanor, while Diana's shoulders were tense, her arms crossed defensively. It was clear that something was being addressed. Eliza turned her attention back to the window, watching as the city below came into view. Tiny dots of light glimmered in the evening haze, creating a sprawling tapestry that stretched toward the horizon. The sight was comforting, a reminder of the world's vastness and her own resilience within it. When the plane finally touched down, the familiar jolt of the landing gear meeting the tarmac snapped her from her thoughts. Passengers clapped softly, a common ritual among relieved travelers. Eliza unbuckled her seatbelt, her movements deliberate as she prepared to disembark. The intercom crackled again, and the captain's voice came on, thanking everyone for their patience and wishing them well on their onward journeys. Eliza appreciated the sincerity in his tone, though she couldn't help but wonder if he was aware of the events that had unfolded during the flight. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Eliza noticed Diana moving down the aisle. Her usual air of confidence was noticeably absent, replaced by a stiffness that bordered on discomfort. When Diana passed Eliza's row, their eyes met briefly. This time, there was no hostility, no condescension, just a fleeting look that could have been regret, though Eliza couldn't be sure. By the time the plane came to a stop and the seatbelt sign turned off, Eliza felt ready to move forward. She stood, gathering her belongings and taking one last glance around the cabin. Sophie, ever the professional, was assisting passengers with a warm smile, her presence a beacon of reassurance amidst the residual tension. As Eliza stepped into the aisle, she noticed Sophie walking toward her. "Thank you for your patience, ma'am," Sophie said softly. "If there's anything else we can do for you, please don't hesitate to let us know." Eliza smiled. You've already done more than enough. Thank you for everything. Sophie nodded, her expression genuine. Safe travels. With that, Eliza turned toward the exit, joining the line of passengers making their way off the plane. Mark, who had been oddly silent throughout the flight, fell into step beside her. That was quite a trip, he said, his tone hesitant. Eliza glanced at him, her expression neutral. It certainly was. Mark cleared his throat as though searching for the right words. I should have said something earlier. I'm sorry I didn't. You handled it better than I would have. Eliza paused, surprised by the admission. She nodded slowly. Thank you, Mark. That means a lot. As they reached the front of the plane, Eliza noticed Diana standing near the exit, her posture stiff and her face pale. Beside her stood Sophie, speaking in low tones that carried an unmistakable air of authority. Whatever was being said, it was clear that Diana was no longer in control. Eliza walked past without a word, her steps light as she exited into the terminal. The fresh air of the terminal felt like a balm against the tension of the flight. For the first time in hours, Eliza felt truly free. This wasn't just about reclaiming her dignity. It was about knowing she had faced a challenge and emerged stronger, armed with the knowledge that she could stand her ground with grace and resolve. As she walked toward the baggage claim, Eliza allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The journey had been far from smooth, but it had reminded her of something essential. Her worth was not up for debate. And no one, not even someone like Diana, had the power to take that away. The terminal bustled with activity as passengers streamed off the plane, a mix of relief and anticipation on their faces. Eliza walked calmly, her bag slung over her shoulder, each step carrying the weight of a quiet triumph. The events of the flight still swirled in her mind, but now they felt distant, like a storm that had passed. Mark trailed a few steps behind her, his usual brisk demeanor softened by what seemed to be a lingering discomfort. Whether it was guilt over his earlier silence or something else, Eliza couldn't say. She chose not to dwell on it. The focus now was moving forward. As they approached the baggage carousel, Eliza allowed herself a moment to reflect. She had come onto that plane prepared for a straightforward journey, one that would get her from point A to point B without incident. What she'd encountered instead was a test of her patience, dignity, and resilience. Yet despite everything, she had held her ground. Back, from the corner of her eye, Eliza noticed Sophie exiting the plane behind her, speaking briefly with a fellow crew member before heading toward the terminal's staff area. Diana, however, was nowhere to be seen. The absence spoke volumes. Eliza. Mark's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see him gesturing toward a nearby bench. Do you want to sit while we wait for the bags? She hesitated, then nodded. Sure. They found seats overlooking the carousel, the rhythmic clatter of luggage tumbling onto the conveyor belt filling the space. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of the earlier events creating an unspoken tension. Finally, Mark broke the silence. I know I didn't handle that well, he admitted, his tone uncharacteristically subdued. I should have said something. Supported you. Eliza regarded him thoughtfully. Mark's bluntness was often a double-edged sword. Efficient in business, but sometimes abrasive in personal interactions. This moment of vulnerability, however, was a side she rarely saw. It's all right, Mark, she said, her voice even. I understand why you didn't step in. It was an uncomfortable situation for everyone. Still, he pressed, you handled it with more grace than I would have. Most people would have lashed out, but you. He paused, searching for the right words. You stayed calm, found a solution, and made your point without causing a scene. That's not easy. Eliza offered a small smile, appreciating his acknowledgement. Thank you, Mark. I wasn't sure how it would turn out, but I'm glad I handled it the way I did. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their luggage. Mark stood first, hoisting his suitcase off the conveyor belt with a practiced ease. Eliza followed suit, her bag's familiar weight grounding her further. As they headed toward the exit, a familiar figure appeared in the corner of Eliza's vision. Diana stood off to the side, her usual commanding presence replaced by a subdued posture. Her arms were crossed tightly, and her face was pale. Standing beside her was Sophie, whose calm yet firm expression suggested that the conversation they were having was not a pleasant one. Eliza slowed her pace, her curiosity momentarily piqued. She didn't need to hear the words to understand what was happening. Diana was being held accountable. Whether it was an immediate reprimand or a formal report, Eliza knew that her actions had consequences. For a brief moment, Diana's eyes met Eliza's across the terminal. There was no malice in her gaze this time, no superiority or disdain, only a flicker of something Eliza couldn't quite place. Regret? Defiance? It didn't matter. Eliza met her gaze evenly, then turned away. Bookmark? Mark noticed the exchange but said nothing, his focus shifting to the sliding doors ahead. The cool air of the terminal exit greeted them as they stepped outside, the city's evening buzz enveloping them. Well, Mark said, breaking the silence as they waited for a taxi. If this trip is any indication, tomorrow's meeting should be a breeze. Eliza chuckled softly, appreciating the attempt at humor. Let's hope so. They shared a brief smile before Mark's taxi arrived. He gave her a quick nod as he climbed into the car. See you at the hotel. Eliza waved him off, then turned her attention to the street, where her own ride was approaching. As she climbed into the back seat, she allowed herself a moment to relax fully. The rhythmic hum of the car's engine felt soothing after the turbulence of the day. Looking out the window, Eliza's thoughts drifted to the lessons she'd taken from the flight. She had faced humiliation and discomfort, but had refused to let them define her. By standing up for herself in a measured, thoughtful way, she had not only reclaimed her dignity, but also set a precedent for how she would handle challenges moving forward. The car wound its way through the city streets, the glow of streetlights casting soft patterns on the windows. Eliza leaned back, a small smile playing on her lips. This wasn't the end of her journey. There were always new challenges to face, new obstacles to overcome. But she felt more prepared now, more grounded in her own strength. As the car pulled up to her hotel, Eliza gathered her things and stepped out, the cool night air refreshing against her skin. The city buzzed with life, a constant reminder that the world moved forward no matter what. And so would she. The lobby of the hotel was a quiet haven, a stark contrast to the bustling terminal Eliza had just left behind. She paused briefly at the reception desk to confirm her reservation before heading toward the elevator, her luggage trailing softly behind her. The events of the day still lingered in her mind, but the calm ambiance of the hotel provided a much-needed respite. As she stepped into her room, Eliza exhaled deeply. The space was simple yet comfortable, with neutral tones and soft lighting that invited relaxation. She placed her bag by the desk and sank onto the edge of the bed, letting the quiet of the room settle over her like a blanket. She thought back to the flight, not just the moments of humiliation and tension, but also the small victories along the way. Diana's behavior had been unacceptable, but Eliza had chosen a path that upheld her dignity. That choice, she realized, had made all the difference. Eliza reached for her phone, scrolling through messages before pausing to open a note she had written earlier in the week. It was a list of affirmations she often referred to during challenging times. I am strong enough to face adversity. My worth is not defined by others' opinions. Grace and resilience are my greatest strengths. Reading the words now, they resonated more deeply than ever. Eliza had always believed in handling conflict with composure, but the flight had reinforced just how powerful that approach could be. She set the phone aside and turned her attention to the window, where the city's lights twinkled like scattered stars. The world outside seemed so vast, and yet today's events had reminded her of the importance of standing her ground in even the smallest moments. Her thoughts drifted to Diana. Eliza didn't feel anger anymore, just a sense of closure. Diana's actions were a reflection of her own struggles, not Eliza's worth. While Eliza didn't excuse Diana's behavior, she could now see it through a lens of understanding. Still, accountability mattered. Eliza was proud of how she had handled the situation, not only for herself, but for the countless other passengers who might have experienced similar treatment. By speaking up, she had disrupted the cycle, if only a little. The faint buzz of her phone drew Eliza's attention. A message from Mark flashed on the screen. Dinner at 7? Let me know. Eliza smiled softly, appreciating the gesture. Despite his earlier silence, Mark had made an effort to acknowledge his shortcomings. That in itself was progress. She typed out a quick reply, "Sounds good. See you in the lobby." As she set the phone aside, Eliza felt a renewed sense of purpose. Tomorrow's meeting loomed large, but she felt prepared to face it. The strength she had rediscovered today would carry her through whatever challenges lay ahead. When 7 p.m. arrived, Eliza made her way down to the hotel restaurant, where Mark was already seated at a table near the window. He greeted her with a nod, gesturing for her to join him. "How are you feeling?" he asked as she settled into her seat. "Better," Eliza replied honestly. "It was a rough flight, but I'm glad it's over." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about what happened. The way you handled it. It made me realize I need to be more assertive in situations like that. I admire how you stayed calm and found a solution." Eliza gave a small smile, appreciating his words. "Thank you, Mark. It wasn't easy, but sometimes staying calm is the only way to get through to people." Their conversation shifted to lighter topics as the evening progressed. By the time they left the restaurant, Eliza felt lighter, her spirits buoyed by the promise of a fresh start tomorrow. As she returned to her room, Eliza reflected on the day one last time. The journey had been far from perfect, but it had been a testament to her resilience. She had faced adversity with grace and emerged stronger for it. Eliza thought about the other passengers on the plane, especially the couple who had voiced their frustrations about Diana. Perhaps her actions had inspired them too, showing them that speaking up could lead to change. Pulling back the covers of her bed, Eliza settled in for the night. The soft glow of the city lights filtered through the curtains, a gentle reminder of the vastness of the world and the small but significant impact one person could have. In the quiet stillness, Eliza felt a sense of peace. She had stood her ground, upheld her values, and reclaimed her dignity. And as she drifted off to sleep, she carried with her the knowledge that every challenge was an opportunity to grow, to learn, and to rise above. Eliza's story wasn't about a single moment of triumph, but about the quiet power of resilience and dignity. Life would continue to present challenges, but she now knew she had the strength to face them head-on. For Diana, the events of that flight would likely mark a turning point, an opportunity to reflect and perhaps change. Whether she chose to take that opportunity was a story for another day. As for Eliza, she moved forward with grace, knowing that her worth was never in question. The flight had ended, but her journey had just begun. This story of Eliza and her quiet triumph on a turbulent flight reminds us of the importance of dignity, self-worth, and the power of standing up for ourselves in the face of injustice. Eliza's journey wasn't about seeking revenge or creating a spectacle. It was about reclaiming her right to respect with grace and resilience. The video captures a universal lesson. Sometimes, life places us in uncomfortable situations to test our character. How we respond defines who we are. Eliza chose a path of calm determination, proving that strength doesn't always have to roar. It can be found in the quiet conviction to do what's right. At the same time, the story invites us to reflect on accountability. Diana's behavior, though harsh and unjustifiable, serves as a reminder that our actions, even in small interactions, can have lasting effects on others. It's a call to approach others with kindness and professionalism, regardless of the challenges we might face in our personal lives. For those watching, Eliza's story is a beacon of hope. It tells us that even in the face of humiliation or adversity, we can choose how to respond, and that choice can turn the tide in ways we might not expect. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. Share your stories with us. What moments in your life taught you the power of standing up for yourself? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss out on more meaningful stories like this one. We value your voice, so be sure to leave your thoughts about Eliza's journey in the comments below. Your perspective might just inspire someone else to face their own challenges with strength and grace. Thank you for being a part of this story, and we can't wait to share the next one with you.